James Carter stood perfectly still outside Buckingham Palace, his red uniform crisp against the grey London morning. Tourists gathered around him, snapping photos and trying to make him smile. He had been a royal guard for 3 years now, and he knew the routine by heart. Stand straight, eyes forward, never break character. But today felt different somehow. There was a strange tension in the air that James not quite explain. The morning had started like any other Tuesday. James woke up at 5 in the morning, put on his uniform with precision, and checked every button twice. His wife, Sarah, had kissed him goodbye, reminding him to stay safe. She always said that even though being a royal guard seemed like the safest job in the world, James would smile and promise her he would be home for dinner. Their daughter, Emma, was only 6 years old. She loved hearing stories about the palace. As James took his position at 8 in the morning, he noticed the crowd was larger than usual. School groups, families, and tourists from all over the world filled the courtyard. Children pointed at him with excitement, and parents explained the history of the royal guards. James felt proud to be part of this tradition, even though his feet hurt after standing for hours. The bearskin hat on his head was heavy, and the morning sun was getting warmer. Around 10:30, something caught his attention. A man in a dark jacket was walking through the crowd in an unusual way. Most tourists moved slowly, taking pictures and enjoying the moment. But this man was different. He walked quickly, his eyes darting around nervously. He carried a large backpack that seemed too full, and he kept touching it as if making sure it was still there. James felt his military training kick in. After serving in the army before joining the Royal Guards, he'd learned to notice things others might miss. The man stopped near a group of school children who were sitting on the ground. Their teacher was counting heads and organizing them for a group photo. The man placed his backpack down carefully, right next to where the children sat. Then he did something that made James's heart skip a beat. The man looked at his watch, glanced at the backpack one more time, and started walking away. He did not look back. He did not slow down. He just left his bag there and disappeared into the crowd. James felt every muscle in his body tense. He knew the strict rules. Royal guards were not supposed to move or speak while on duty. They were living statues, symbols of tradition and discipline. Breaking protocol could cost him his job. But something in his gut told him this was not right. No tourist would leave such a large backpack behind, especially not next to children. The way the man had looked at his watch, the nervous energy, the quick departure, everything pointed to danger. He thought about Sarah and Emma. He thought about the children sitting just meters away, laughing and sharing sandwiches. He thought about the hundreds of people in the courtyard, taking selfies and making memories. And he made a decision that would change everything. James broke position. For the first time in 3 years, he stepped forward. The tourists around him gasped. Some thought it was part of a special ceremony. Others raised their phones to record this unusual moment. James walked quickly toward the abandoned backpack. His fellow guards noticed immediately and looked confused. His commanding officer, who stood nearby, started moving toward him with a stern expression. Breaking protocol was serious business. But James did not stop. He could not stop. As he got closer to the backpack, he noticed wires sticking out from the top zipper. His blood ran cold. This was exactly what he had feared. This was exactly why he had broken every rule. He had sworn to follow. He turned to the crowd and did something royal guards never do. He spoke. His voice was loud and clear, cutting through the happy chatter of tourists. He told everyone to move back immediately. The urgency in his tone made people freeze. Some looked confused. Others started backing away slowly. The teacher with the school children stood up, sensing something was wrong. James kept his eyes on the backpack, his training telling him not to touch it, not to get too close. But he needed to get these people away from danger. Within seconds, other guards rushed to help. They had seen James break protocol and heard his warning. Whatever was happening, it was serious enough for their colleague to risk his career. Together, they started clearing the area, their voices firm but controlled. The crowd began to understand. This was not a show. This was real. Something was very wrong with that backpack sitting innocently on the ground. The palace courtyard transformed from a peaceful tourist spot into a scene of controlled chaos within minutes. James continued, directing people away from the suspicious backpack, while his fellow guards formed a perimeter. His heart pounded in his chest, but his voice remained steady. Years of military discipline took over, pushing aside the fear that threatened to overwhelm him. He could see the confusion on people's faces turning into genuine concern as they realized something serious was happening. The commanding officer, Captain Reynolds, reached James first. His face was red with anger, ready to demand an explanation for this unprecedented breach of protocol. But when James pointed at the backpack and explained what he had seen, the captain's expression changed instantly. Reynolds had served in combat zones before joining the palace security. He knew what James was describing, without wasting another second. He grabbed his radio and called for the bomb disposal unit. The word bomb sent ripples of panic through the remaining crowd. Parents grabbed their children and ran. The school teacher, a young woman named Miss Patterson, tried to keep her students calm while moving them toward the exit. Some children were crying, not understanding why their fun field trip had turned scary. Tourists dropped their cameras and pushed toward the gates. James saw an elderly woman trip in the confusion, and he quickly helped her up, supporting her as she walked to safety. Every second felt like an hour. The backpack sat there, silent and still, but possibly counting down to disaster. Within 5 minutes, police vehicles surrounded the palace. Officers in bright yellow vests created a wider security zone, pushing everyone back several hundred meters. The famous palace, usually open and welcoming, suddenly became a fortress. Sirens wailed across London as emergency services rushed to the scene. News helicopters appeared in the sky, their cameras pointed down at the unfolding drama. James stood at the inner perimeter, refusing to leave until everyone was safe. Captain Reynolds did not order him back. Understanding that James needed to see this through, the bomb disposal team arrived in their specialized vehicle. 3 experts in heavy protective suits emerged, moving with practiced efficiency. The team leader, a man named Sergeant Harris, approached Captain Reynolds and James for a briefing. James described everything he had seen: the nervous man, the careful placement of the bag, the quick departure, and most importantly, the wires he had spotted. Sergeant Harris listened carefully, his experienced eyes already assessing the situation. He thanked James for his quick action and sharp observation. Those details could save lives, including those of his own team. While one expert approached the backpack with specialized equipment, the others set up a mobile command center. They used robots and cameras to examine the bag without touching it. James watched from a distance, his hands clenched into fists. He thought about Sarah, who was probably seeing this on the news by now. She would be terrified, not knowing if he was safe. He wanted to call her, but his phone was locked in his locker inside the palace. All he could do was wait and watch as the experts did their dangerous work. The robot's camera revealed what James had feared most. Inside the backpack was a complex explosive device, surrounded by metal objects that would act as shrapnel. Sergeant Harris's face grew grim as he studied the images on his screen. This was not an amateur attempt. Whoever built this bomb knew exactly what they were doing. The device was designed to cause maximum casualties in a crowded space. If James had not noticed the suspicious behavior, if he had followed protocol and stayed silent, hundreds of people could have died today. Those schoolchildren eating their lunch would have been closest to the blast. The disposal team worked for nearly 2 hours. They used water jets to disrupt the device, carefully cutting wires and neutralizing the explosive materials. Every person watching held their breath during the process. One wrong move could trigger the bomb. James stood perfectly still again, but this time it was not because of duty. He was frozen by the weight of what had almost happened. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, and the temperature rose. But James felt cold inside. Finally, Sergeant Harris gave the signal. The bomb was safe. The threat was neutralized. A collective sigh of relief spread through the emergency personnel. Officers hugged each other. Some wiped tears from their eyes. The bomb disposal team removed their helmets, their faces drenched in sweat. They had done their job perfectly, but they knew they owed their success to the Royal Guard, who had spotted the danger first. Captain Reynolds placed a hand on James's shoulder, a gesture of respect and gratitude. No words were needed. As the immediate danger passed, the reality of the situation began to sink in. Police detectives arrived to begin their investigation. They needed to find the man who had planted the bomb. Witnesses were interviewed, and security footage from surrounding buildings was collected. James gave a detailed description of the suspect, remembering every detail of his face, his clothes, and his movements. The detective taking his statement was impressed by James's recall. Military training made him an excellent witness. The palace remained closed for the rest of the day. Tourists were redirected, and the area became a crime scene. James finally got permission to call Sarah. She answered on the first ring, her voice breaking with emotion. She had been watching the news for hours, terrified that something had happened to him. James assured her he was fine, trying to keep his own emotions in check. But when he heard Emma's voice in the background asking if Daddy was okay, his composure cracked. Tears rolled down his cheeks as he promised his daughter he would be home soon. The hours following the incident felt surreal to James. He sat in a small office inside the palace, wrapped in a blanket despite the warm day. A palace physician checked his vital signs while detectives waited patiently to continue their questions. His hands shook slightly as he held a cup of tea, the adrenaline finally wearing off and leaving him exhausted. Outside the window, he could see forensic teams still working around the area where the bomb had been placed. The reality of how close they had all come to tragedy was overwhelming. Detective Inspector Collins, a woman with sharp eyes and a kind manner, sat across from James. She had been investigating terrorism cases for 15 years, and she needed every detail James could remember. He closed his eyes and walked her through the morning again. The man had been around 40 years old, with dark hair starting to gray at the temples. He wore a black jacket despite the warm weather, probably to hide something. His shoes were expensive, not the kind a struggling person would wear. These details mattered because they would help identify the suspect from security. Cameras throughout London. Meanwhile, across the city, a massive manhunt was underway. Every police officer in London had the suspect's description. Transit stations, airports, and major roads were being monitored. The man had left the bomb around 10:30, which meant he could be anywhere by now. But Detective Collins believed he would stay in London to watch the news, to see if his plan had succeeded. These types of criminals often could not resist following the aftermath of their actions. It was a psychological profile that had helped catch suspects before. Back at the palace, the Royal Guard administration faced a unique situation. James had broken the most fundamental rule of his position. He had moved and spoken while on duty without permission. Technically, this was grounds for immediate dismissal, but he had also potentially saved hundreds of lives. Captain Reynolds had already filed a report explaining the circumstances, strongly defending James's actions. The decision about his future would come from higher authorities, possibly even from the royal family themselves. For now, James was suspended from duty pending investigation, a standard procedure that felt like punishment despite the circumstances. The news spread across the world within hours. Major networks interrupted their regular programming to report the incident at Buckingham Palace. Reporters stood outside the gates, describing the scene and praising the unnamed royal guard who had prevented a massacre. Social media exploded with speculation and praise. People shared videos taken by tourists showing James breaking formation and warning the crowd. The footage was grainy, but it clearly showed his decisive action. Hashtags like Hero Guard and London Strong trended worldwide. But James was unaware of any of this, still locked in meetings and debriefs inside the palace. Sarah arrived at the palace by early evening, bringing Emma with her. Palace security made an exception and allowed them into a private room where James waited. The moment Emma saw her father, she ran into his arms crying. James held his daughter tight, feeling the weight of the day finally breaking through his professional composure. Sarah joined the embrace, and the three of them stood there for several minutes, just grateful to be together. No words could express what they were feeling. The what-ifs were too terrible to consider, so they focused on the fact that everyone was safe that night. James went home to find his street blocked by news vans. Somehow, reporters had discovered his identity and address. Cameras flashed as he and his family hurried from the car to their front door. Neighbors stood in their yards watching, some waving in support. Mrs. Chen from next door brought over a casserole. Her eyes filled with tears as she thanked James for his bravery. The attention was uncomfortable and strange. James had not done anything for glory or recognition. He had simply done what his training and instincts told him to do. The idea that he was now being called a hero felt wrong somehow, inside their small home. James tried to maintain normalcy for Emma's sake. They ate dinner together and he helped her with homework, listening to her talk about her day at school. She had heard about what happened from her teacher, who had explained it in simple terms. Emma was proud of her daddy, but she was also scared. She asked if the bad man would come back. James assured her that the police would catch him and that she was safe. After tucking Emma into bed, James finally allowed himself to process everything. He sat on the couch with Sarah, and the tears he had been holding back all day finally came. Sarah held him as he cried, understanding that her husband was dealing with something traumatic. He kept seeing those children in his mind, sitting so close to the bomb, completely unaware of the danger. He kept thinking about what would have happened if he had followed the rules, if he had stayed silent and still, like a proper royal guard should. The guilt of even considering staying quiet haunted him, even though he had ultimately made the right choice. Sarah reminded him that he had saved lives, that he was a hero. But James struggled to see himself that way. The next morning brought both good news and complications. Police announced they had identified the suspect through security footage and witness descriptions. His name was Marcus Webb, a 42-year-old engineer with no prior criminal record. He had apparently become radicalized through online groups over the past year. His apartment had been searched, revealing evidence of bomb-making materials and extremist literature. A nationwide alert was issued for his arrest. Knowing the suspect's identity brought some relief, but also raised questions about how someone like him could plan such an attack without being detected earlier. For James, the morning brought an unexpected visitor. A senior official from the palace arrived at his home with an official letter. James's heart sank, assuming it was his termination notice. Instead, the letter informed him that his actions were under review, but that preliminary findings praised his judgment and courage. He was being placed on paid administrative leave while the investigation continued. More importantly, the royal family had personally requested to meet with him once the immediate crisis was resolved. This was unprecedented, and James did not know what to think about it. 3 days after the incident, the media attention showed no signs of slowing down. James's face was on every newspaper and news website. Reporters camped outside his house, hoping for an interview or even just a photo. The constant attention was suffocating. James could not take Emma to school without cameras following them. Sarah could not go to work at the local library without being stopped by strangers wanting to talk about her heroic husband. Their quiet, normal life had been completely disrupted. James found himself missing the simple routine of standing guard. Even though his feet used to hurt and the uniform was heavy, the police investigation into Marcus Webb intensified. Detectives discovered that he had been planning the attack for months. His computer revealed searches about palace security, crowd patterns, and explosive materials. He had visited Buckingham Palace several times in the weeks before the attack, studying the guards' routines and the flow of tourists. What troubled investigators most was that Webb had not acted alone. Evidence suggested he was part of a larger network, though they had no concrete leads yet. This meant the threat might not be over. James felt a chill whenever he thought about it. He had stopped one attack, but there could be others planned. On the 4th day, Marcus Webb was captured. Police received a tip from a hotel owner in Manchester who recognized him from news reports. Webb had been hiding in a small room, watching coverage of the failed attack on television. When armed officers burst in, he surrendered without resistance. The arrest brought relief to everyone involved, especially James. Knowing the man was in custody made it easier to sleep at night. But it also meant the investigation would now dig deeper into Webb's motivations and connections. James would likely be called to testify in court, reliving that morning over and over again. Meanwhile, the palace administration completed their internal investigation. Captain Reynolds was interviewed extensively about the protocols and James's actions. Other guards who were present that day gave statements supporting James's version of events. The bomb disposal team provided expert testimony about the device's lethality and the narrow window of time they had to evacuate the area. Every piece of evidence pointed to the same conclusion. James Carter had prevented a catastrophic terrorist attack through exceptional awareness and courage. His decision to break protocol was not only justified, but necessary. The official decision came on a Friday afternoon. James was called to a formal meeting at the palace, and he wore his civilian clothes. Unsure if he was still considered a royal guard, Captain Reynolds greeted him warmly. A good sign, but James remained nervous. He was led into a grand room where senior palace officials sat at a long table. The atmosphere was formal and intimidating. James stood at attention, his military training automatic even in civilian clothes. The head of palace security, Sir William Bradford, began reading from an official document. The verdict was clear and surprising. Not only was James fully exonerated of any wrongdoing, but he was being commended for his actions. Sir William explained that while protocol was important, the primary duty of any royal guard was to protect people. James had fulfilled that duty in the highest manner possible. Furthermore, his case would be used to revise training protocols for all guards. They would now receive additional training in threat assessment and be given clear authority to act when public safety was at immediate risk. James's actions would change how royal guards operated in the future. But the meeting was not over. Sir William stood and asked James to follow him to another room. They walked through the palace's magnificent hallways, past portraits of kings and queens from centuries past. James had walked these corridors many times during his service, but never like this. They arrived at a private sitting room, beautifully decorated with antique furniture and artwork. Sir William asked James to wait, then left him alone. James's heart raced. He had no idea what was happening. But the formal nature of everything suggested something significant. 10 minutes later, the door opened again. James stood immediately and then froze. Members of the royal family entered the room. He had seen them from a distance during ceremonies, but never in a private setting like this. They greeted him warmly, thanking him for his service and his bravery. The conversation that followed was surreal. They asked about his family, his background, and his experience as a royal guard. They wanted to understand the man behind the uniform, the person who had made such a critical decision under pressure. James answered honestly, his voice steady despite his nervousness. They explained that his actions had not only saved lives, but had also prevented an attack that could have had international consequences. The bombing of Buckingham Palace would have been a symbolic victory for terrorists worldwide. It would have damaged Britain's image and caused fear across the nation. By stopping it, James had done more than prevent casualties. He had protected something intangible, but equally important. The sense of security and normalcy that people deserved to feel in their own country. They wanted him to know that his service was appreciated at the highest level. Before leaving, informed James that he would be receiving a formal recognition for his actions. The details would be announced publicly soon, but they wanted to tell him personally first. They also assured him that his position as a royal guard was secure if he wished to continue. However, they understood if the experience had changed his perspective on the role. They would support whatever decision he made about his future. James thanked them, overwhelmed by the honor and the kindness they had shown him. As they left, he stood alone in the beautiful room, trying to process everything that had just happened. That evening, James sat with Sarah and Emma in their living room. The news vans had finally left their street after police enforced privacy regulations. They could finally have a quiet evening as a family. James told them about the meeting, about the recognition he would receive, and about the choice he now had to make. Should he return to his position as a royal guard? After everything that had happened, could he stand still and silent again, watching crowds pass by? Or had this experience changed him too much to go back to that life? Sarah held his hand, telling him she would support whatever he decided. Emma, in her innocent wisdom, said she just wanted her daddy to be happy and safe. The following week brought a new challenge that James had not anticipated. He was invited to appear on national television to share his story. The producers of a major morning show had been requesting an interview since the incident occurred, and the palace gave its approval for James to speak publicly if he chose. Sarah thought it might be good for him to share his perspective, to help people understand what had happened that day. But James was terrified of speaking in front of cameras. Standing still in a uniform was one thing. Sitting on a couch answering personal questions was completely different. After much consideration, James agreed to do one interview. He wanted people to understand that he was just an ordinary person doing his job, not some fearless hero from a movie. On the morning of the interview, he wore a simple suit and tried to calm his nerves. Sarah came with him to the studio, holding his hand as they sat in the green room waiting. Makeup artists fussed over his appearance while producers explained how the segment would work. Everything felt strange and artificial. James missed the simplicity of his guard post, where expectations were clear and routine was comforting. The interview went better than James expected. The host was respectful and genuine, asking thoughtful questions rather than sensationalizing the story. James talked about his military background, his love for his job as a Royal Guard, and the split-second decision he made that morning. He explained how his training had prepared him to notice unusual behavior and trust his instincts. When asked if he considered himself a hero, James became emotional. He said the real heroes were the bomb disposal team who risked their lives to disarm the device. He was just a guard who saw something wrong and acted on it. His humility and sincerity resonated with viewers across the country. After the interview aired, James received thousands of messages through social media and the palace. People from all over the world thanked him for his service. Parents of the school children, who had been in danger, sent heartfelt letters expressing their gratitude. Teachers wrote to say they were using his story to teach their students about courage and following your instincts. Veterans reached out to share their own experiences of making difficult decisions under pressure. The overwhelming support touched James deeply, though he still struggled to see himself as the hero everyone else saw. To him, he had simply done what needed to be done. But not everyone was supportive. James also received messages criticizing his decision to break protocol. Some people, especially those with military backgrounds, argued that discipline and following orders were paramount. They suggested that James's actions set a dangerous precedent, that it could encourage other guards to abandon their posts for lesser reasons. These messages hurt because James understood their perspective. He had struggled with the same concerns. What separated a justified break-in protocol from simple disobedience? How could future guards know when it was appropriate to act? These were complex questions without easy answers. The debate reached professional circles, too. Military journals published articles analyzing the incident from different angles. Some praised the palace for recognizing that rigid protocols could not account for every situation. Others worried about maintaining discipline in security forces. James read these discussions with mixed feelings. He appreciated the thoughtful analysis, but it was strange to see his personal decision dissected and debated by strangers. It reminded him that his choice that morning had implications far beyond saving lives in that moment. It had sparked a larger conversation about duty, protocol, and moral judgment. 3 weeks after the incident, James made his decision about returning to duty. He met with Captain Reynolds and Sir William Bradford to discuss his future. James explained that he still loved being a Royal Guard, but he could not return to the same role. Standing motionless for hours while crowds passed by would never feel the same after what he had experienced. He needed a position where he could use his skills and instincts more actively. He wanted to help train other guards to share the lessons he had learned, to ensure that others would be prepared if they ever faced a similar situation. His request was granted immediately. James's new role as a training instructor began the following month. He worked with new recruits, teaching them the history and traditions of the Royal Guards. But he also incorporated threat awareness and decision-making exercises into the curriculum. He shared his story honestly, including his doubts and fears. He wanted these young guards to understand that being brave did not mean being fearless. It meant acting despite fear when action was necessary. The recruits responded well to his teaching style. He was not some distant authority figure, but someone who had lived through an extraordinary test and was willing to share the lessons learned. Meanwhile, Marcus Webb's trial proceeded through the legal system. James was called to testify about what he had observed that morning. Sitting in the witness box, facing the man who had tried to kill innocent people, was one of the hardest things James had ever done. Webb showed no remorse, staring at James with cold eyes throughout the testimony. The prosecutor asked James to describe Webb's behavior, the placement of the bag, and the aftermath. Every detail mattered because the prosecution needed to prove premeditation and intent. James answered clearly and honestly, knowing his words would help ensure justice was served. The trial lasted 2 weeks and received international attention. Evidence showed that Webb had been radicalized through online forums and had planned the attack as a statement against what he called Western decadence. He had specifically chosen Buckingham Palace because of its symbolic importance. The bomb had been designed to kill as many people as possible, particularly targeting areas where children and families gathered. When the verdict came back guilty on all charges, James felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Webb would spend the rest of his life in prison, unable to hurt anyone else. Justice had been served, though it could never undo the trauma or the fear that so many people had experienced. On a quiet evening after the trial concluded, James sat in his backyard watching Emma play. Sarah joined him with 2 cups of tea, and they watched their daughter's innocent joy in simple things. Life was slowly returning to normal, or at least a new version of normal. James would never be anonymous again. People recognized him in stores and restaurants, wanting to shake his hand or take photos. But the intense media attention had faded. He could take Emma to school without cameras following. Sarah could go to work without being stopped constantly. They were rebuilding their private life while James continued his new role at the palace. 6 months after the incident, James stood in the Grand Hall of Buckingham Palace wearing his full Royal Guard uniform for a special ceremony. The room was filled with distinguished guests, fellow guards, and most importantly, Sarah and Emma. Today was the formal recognition ceremony where James would receive the George Medal for his actions. This honor was reserved for acts of great bravery, and James felt humbled to be receiving it. As he waited for the ceremony to begin, he thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. From a scared man breaking protocol to a decorated guard inspiring others. His life had transformed in ways he never imagined possible. The ceremony was elegant and moving. Officials spoke about James's quick thinking and moral courage. They praised his ability to make the right decision under pressure when following rules would have led to tragedy. The medal itself was beautiful, hanging on a ribbon that represented honor and service. When it was placed around his neck, James thought about all the people who had supported him through this journey. Captain Reynolds, who had defended him from the start. The bomb disposal team who had trusted his assessment. Sarah and Emma, who had stood by him during the chaos and uncertainty. This medal represented all of them, not just him. After the ceremony, James met with the school children who had been in danger that morning. Miss Patterson had organized a reunion at the palace, believing it would help the children process their experience. They arrived excited and nervous, remembering the scary day, but also curious to meet the guard who had protected them. James knelt down to their level and talked with them about bravery, fear, and looking out for each other. The children asked questions, some serious and some innocent. One little boy asked if James had superpowers. James laughed and said his only superpower was paying attention and trusting his feelings when something seemed wrong. The parents watched with tears in their eyes, grateful beyond words. The event received positive media coverage, showing a different side of the story. It was not just about terrorism and danger anymore. It was about community, protection, and the bonds that connected people in moments of crisis. James hoped this would be the last major media event, that he could finally fade back into a quieter existence. He loved his work training new guards, and he wanted to focus on that rather than being a public figure. The palace respected his wishes and began declining most interview requests on his behalf. Slowly, the attention shifted away, allowing James to rebuild his sense of normalcy in his training classes. James used his experience to teach important lessons about awareness and judgment. He created scenarios where recruits had to make quick decisions with incomplete information. Some criticized this approach as too stressful, but James believed it was necessary. Real threats would not come with clear warnings. Guards needed to develop their instincts and trust themselves to act when necessary. He also emphasized the psychological toll of such decisions, encouraging guards to seek support if they ever faced similar situations. Mental health was just as important as physical readiness, something military culture had not always recognized. One afternoon, about a year after the incident, James received an unexpected visitor at the training facility. Sergeant Harris from the bomb disposal team had requested to meet with him. They sat in a quiet office and talked about that day from both perspectives. Harris explained that when he arrived at the scene and saw the bomb design, he knew immediately how deadly it would have been. The device had been sophisticated, packed with materials that would have caused devastating injuries across a wide area. If it had detonated, casualties would have been in the hundreds. Harris wanted James to understand the full impact of his actions, not to burden him, but to validate the choice he had made. Harris also shared something personal. He had a daughter Emma's age, and when he worked on that bomb, he kept thinking about his own child. Knowing that James had saved children like their daughters created a bond between them. They became friends after that meeting, occasionally having coffee and talking about their families. Both men carried the weight of that day differently, but they understood each other in ways others could not. Their friendship helped James process lingering guilt and doubt. If someone as experienced as Harris validated his actions, perhaps he really had done the right thing. As time passed, James found peace in his new role and routine. Training guards gave him purpose and allowed him to make a lasting impact on palace security. His story became part of the official training curriculum, studied by every new recruit. The protocol changes he had inspired were now standard practice. Guards received better training in threat assessment and were empowered to act when necessary. The rigid tradition of absolute stillness was balanced with practical security considerations. James had not just saved lives that one morning. He had changed an entire system, making it more responsive and effective. That legacy meant more to him than any medal or recognition. Emma grew up hearing her father's story, though James and Sarah always presented it carefully, emphasizing the importance of helping others rather than glorifying danger. She became interested in security and safety, often talking about wanting to protect people like her daddy did. James supported her interests while encouraging her to find her own path. Whatever she chose to do, he wanted her to understand that heroism was not about seeking danger. It was about being prepared, paying attention, and acting with courage when others needed help. These were lessons that applied to any career in any life. On the second anniversary of the incident, James returned to his old post at Buckingham Palace. It was a symbolic gesture, standing where he had stood that morning 2 years ago. The palace had organized a small memorial ceremony to honor the day when tragedy was prevented. Survivors from the crowd that morning attended, along with the schoolchildren who were older now, but still remembered their field trip that turned frightening. James stood in his red uniform, perfectly still as tradition demanded, but with a difference. He knew now that tradition and duty were important, but they served a higher purpose, protecting human life and dignity. As tourists gathered around him that afternoon, taking photos and marveling at the famous royal guards, James felt a sense of completion. His journey had come full circle from a guard following protocol, to a man breaking rules to save lives, to a teacher helping others understand when and how to make such choices. The silence he maintained at his post was no longer empty. It was filled with meaning, with awareness, with readiness to act if needed. He had learned that true strength was not about following orders blindly. It was about understanding the purpose behind those orders, and having the courage to adapt when circumstances demanded it. When his shift ended that evening, James walked home through London's streets. He was no longer front-page news, no longer stopped constantly by strangers. Life had returned to a comfortable rhythm. Sarah was making dinner, Emma was doing homework, and their small house felt like a sanctuary. James hung up his uniform carefully, as he did every day, treating it with respect. Tomorrow, he would return to training recruits, sharing his knowledge and experience with the next generation. The bomb that never exploded had changed his life completely, but in the end, it had led him to exactly where he needed to be. From silence to heroism and back to a meaningful silence, James Carter had found his purpose.